Before we get started with today's podcast on DePaul basketball, head on over to the 199 website and get yourself outfitted in retro gear. If you're new to the podcast, leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you really enjoy it, send a link to a friend who would enjoy hearing our weekly discussions about basketball and basketball culture. Now, on to the show.
Isn't it amazing when Michigan can keep this game to a 19-foot 9-inch game inside that three-point line? It's all theirs. Nice move by Steve Fisher here. Turn it into the 19.
All right, welcome to the 199 podcast, where it's time to jump back to 1991. I'm the Chucker, 199's resident historian, and we're thrilled to welcome 1991 McDonald's All-American Tom Kleinschmidt to the show. A 6'5" forward out of Chicago's Gordon Tech, Kleinschmidt was a first-team parade All-American in 1991, earning a spot alongside the likes of Jason Kidd, Chris Webber, and fellow Chicagoan Juwan Howard on that esteemed squad. Kleinschmidt later started at DePaul University, where he was the Great Midwest Conference Player of the Year in 1995 after pouring in 21 points per game for the Blue Demons. He later embarked on a professional career overseas that included some standout seasons in Japan. We're going to chat with Tom about his early love of basketball, the class of 1991, his recruitment as a blue-chip prospect, and much, much more as the class of 91 celebrates its 30th anniversary. So, Tom Kleinschmidt, thanks for joining us here on the 199 podcast.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for thinking of me on this 30th anniversary. It's great to be on. It's great to be on with you. Thanks for having me.
When you hear 30 years, man, does that seem like yesterday, or does that seem like a different lifetime ago?
A little of both. You know, it goes quick. If you tell me 30 years ago, I'm like, man, that's a long time ago. But the memories are fresh. My teammates and, you know, kind of where I played and hung out, and kind of the love of the city still fresh. So a little bit of both.
Yeah, and it's cool because you're kind of back at your stomping grounds. We'll talk later about kind of your coaching back at your alma mater, although it's been kind of rebranded in recent years, but we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So I want to kind of go back to kind of your kind of origins in basketball. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved with the game back when you were a little guy.
Sure. So my father was, obviously went to Weber High School. We're from the west side of Chicago before we moved over to the north side. So he was a basketball official and did a lot. He was a pretty high-profile basketball official. So he used to do a lot of high-end public league games. So I get out of school at St. John Bosco on Grand in Austin, and he picked me up at 2:15, and we go to Westinghouse. He'd have the big Westinghouse games with Aguirre and all those guys. And, you know, I would just follow them all over, and I was if there's a timeout, I want to run out of the crowd and try to make a layup or a free throw. And just traveling with my father, all those big games, really got me hooked. He also did a lawyers league at the Oz Park back in the day, where we drive kind of through the neighborhood of Lincoln Park and hopefully catch a glimpse of Aguirre or Terry Cummings or Tyrone Corbin or Strickland walking down the street. And that kind of got my love for the game and a love for DePaul all at once.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, you know, as your I knew your father played a big kind of role in your kind of experience there. And so, I mean, when did you kind of first say, man, I love this game? You know, was it you fourth, fifth grade? Were you younger, older? Kind of when did you really kind of get really drawn to it and really into it, you know?
Yeah, I think fourth or fifth grade's a good call. I love playing it all the time. But when I really got hooked, basketball high school officials get 3 chances to work downstate. So my dad's first opportunity, that's their end-all, be-all, to work the downstate championship. So it was 84, I believe, when he got his first crack. And I went down, and that's when I got hooked. I mean, my idols are, the normal, Jordan, Bird, Magic, Barkley, all those guys. But my first idols were those guys that played in those high school games. Ben Wilson, Cody Butler, Tim Bankston, all the Simeon guys, LaFonso Ellis, Marcus Liberty, Lavertus Robinson, Steve Bardo, Kenny Battle. So all those guys I saw in 6th, 7th grade, those were my first idols. I was like, man, these guys can play. And my dad was down there reffing, and that's really when I got turned on to basketball and always said, one day my dream is to play downstate and be as good as one of these guys, one day. And that's really where I caught the bug.
Yeah, cool. You and I grew up actually just not far from one another, about a mile from one another. And there's this great neighborhood tale of you dropping 67 points in a grade school game. So you were a good hooper early on, man. No question. You showed a really affinity for the sport. I won't ask who that was against. We won't embarrass them.
Yeah,
But
I remember the school, remember the team in the park. Yeah, it's crazy.
Oh, then go at it, man. Who was it?
It was Reese Park. We played at Reese Park, and we played St. Genevieve from Fullerton and Cicero. It was a small gym. Believe me, it was a small gym, and it was a memory. But looking back now, I wouldn't let one of my players do that. It was a little out of order.
So I mean, listen, man, you had this great affinity for the game. You're showing a lot of talent. When you got to high school, it's interesting because it's like you're one of the best players in your neighborhood growing up, right? You are the best player in your neighborhood growing up, but then your world starts to expand and it gets bigger, and you go to high school. And was the hope that, hey, I want to be the best guy at Gordon Tech, or I want to be the best guy in the Catholic League, or when did things really start to click for you and you start to say, man, I think I can be one of the best guys in the state?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. You're pretty good in your neighborhood. There's a bunch of guys. You play with the older guys in the neighborhood. Borders and Hussey from those guys from Pats and Bertolini, and they kind of beat you up as a little kid. And then you start playing your own age in the neighborhood, and you can do okay on the court. But when you start going to other high school camps, whether it be at Pat's, Fenwick, Joe's, Gordon, Loyola, or where Ignatius, you start going outside of the neighborhood, you're kind of doing okay. And then you start, you're a freshman year, and you start reading about guys like William Gates, who's on the freshman team at Joe's. And you're a freshman, you're on a sophomore team. Now you start thinking, well, how good am I? And you hear of Juwan Howard, and you hear of Donnie Boyce and all these guys that are great friends of mine that I hung out with. But, you start hearing about them, you start playing against them, and then you become friends. And then you get some motivation as well. You get some scouts, so-called scouts, that really never watched a practice or play, but they give you a ranking at the time. So that really motivated me when guys are telling me I'm the 11th best freshman, or I'll never play college basketball. You kind of cut that out and put it above your bed and gives you some motivation. So to answer your question, when I started filtering around in the neighborhood and playing other guys, when I started reading about other guys my age and then got friendly with them and started competing against them, that's when I knew I could play a little bit, when these guys were that good and I was holding my own. So they become great friends and competitors, and we're still friends to this day. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And so I'm curious to dig into that a little bit further. Who was kind of maybe the first guy you played against when you were, a little younger, and you said, like, oh crap, man, like,
yeah,
this is what it's like. Like, this is what big time talent is like. Like, who opened your eyes?
Playing against, it's tough, because we're always playing against older guys, so you kind of got beat up and stuff like that. But I remember watching William Gates in the super sectional. I was a freshman. It was at Hinsdale.
And let's talk William Gates of Hoop Dreams is where he's kind of most kind of known by.
Yeah. So Willie was a freshman starting on that great Joe's team, and they played Eric Anderson of DeSales at Hinsdale Central for the Super. And I was a freshman.
And Eric Anderson went to IU, had a great career there.
Yeah. And was a McDonald's All-American, played with the Knicks, rest in peace. And I remember watching that Super, and I remember, man, this kid's a freshman, and he had like 28. And I remember saying to myself, well, man, I think I'm pretty good, but I don't know. He's a beast, man. I don't know if I can handle him. And then obviously watching Eric Anderson play in our league, didn't play varsity as a freshman, but I remember looking down from the balcony and watching him play and say, that's another level, 6'9", shooting threes. I was like, wow. So those two guys really impressed me as freshmen. And then as I grew up and started playing sophomore, junior year, it's kind of levels of play. The pro guys really do a remarkable job with Chicago young guys. And I mean, Randy Brown, Tim Hardaway, J.J. Anderson, these legends in Chicago really take their time to help the top tier high school players or college players develop. And that's what they really did for me. I mean, Kenny Redfield from Weber, all these guys that had great college and pro careers, whether it be in the NBA or overseas, we all owe them a lot of credit. First of all, they allowed us to play with them, which is the big thing. I mean, these guys are huge stars. And I remember playing at LeClaire Court on 44th and Cicero with Randy Brown, Tim Hardaway, and these guys. I remember going to Fernwood, Garfield Park on the west side. and they would terrorize us, just beat the hell out of us. But it got us better quicker. It really sped our development up. And then we kind of did it for the younger guys below us 4 or 5 years, and so it continues. And I think that's a great thing about Chicago basketball is the older guys really do tend to help the young guys and help them develop and kind of set them straight early. So a lot of credit to those old heads that helped us play ball.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about William Gates, as I said, of Hoop Dreams fame. And, I've heard people tell stories about William that, like, when he was a freshman and sophomore, up until that injury, that dude was on the fast track. I mean, he was legit.
He was.
And it's a shame.
6 foot guard. He's from Cabrini Green. Remember getting a friendly with him and playing with him. He had a terrible knee injury. Still had a really nice high school and college career at Marquette. Just that knee did bother him.
Yeah. And so let's kind of extend that further, because we've talked about kind of this broadening of your basketball life, right? From the neighborhood to now Chicago, to the North Side, then all of Chicago. And then, it's getting bigger and bigger as you start playing in the Catholic League. And so you're seeing more South Side guys and guys from the suburbs. And then you kind of start to go to kind of the national scene, and you start getting some of the camps in the Midwest and maybe some national camps. And that class of 91, there's some real standouts there. You got Glenn Robinson, Jalen Rose, Corey Alexander, Chris Webber, Travis Best. These are a lot of names that are known to basketball fans. As that world started to extend further and you got out of Illinois and out of the Chicago area, who really jumped out to you again and meant, like, especially those guys who were your peers, who jumped out and was like that dude's a hooper, man. That guy's a baller.
Well, obviously, a lot of guys you named, everybody that you named. I mean, we had a AAU team that it will rival any team right now. It was Juwan Howard, Glenn Robinson, Michael Finley, myself, Sherrell Ford, Donnie Boyce, and that was one AAU team. Now it's spread out with all these teams, but we would travel and play in Indiana. Or Ohio, and we kind of stayed in the Midwest. But the first taste I got was Nike camp at Princeton, New Jersey, at Princeton. When I saw Chris Webber really play in a structured system against the top 20 or 30 players in the country and how dominant he was, I mean, it was unbelievable. Grant Hill was another guy that he was a year or two ahead of me. But when those guys were specimens, man, and they were pro players, when I was coming up at that Nike camp. Jason Kidd was unbelievable. But guys in my class, which I think 91, we had 10 kids in the top 100 in Illinois, so we had a great class in the state. But Glenn, Chris, Juwan, Jalen, Jimmy, all those guys were great. But, Michael Finley wasn't that, he was like ranked in the 70s. Damon Stoudemire was in like the 80s. These guys that had unbelievable college and pro careers that you as a player, like, you'd look at the ranking like, man, that guy's 85. Like, he's way better. He's like top 20 player. Howard Nathan, rest in peace, was an unbelievable player. He was ranked pretty highly, but, he didn't get as much love because he was down in Peoria. He was McDonald's All-American, but, just total unbelievable great player. So, but to answer your question, guys like Finley and Damon Stoudemire really jumped off the mat at you when maybe the so-called scouts didn't really see it at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. We being two Chicago guys here, we talk about Michael Finley, and people, outside of Chicago, they don't know maybe that Finley was arguably the third best guy in his high school team. I mean, Sherrell Ford was a first-round draft pick of the Supersonics. This is the same high school team. Donnie Boyce goes to Colorado, is the Big 8 freshman of the year, and he's an NBA draft pick. Finley was probably at the same high school, the third best of those three. And he obviously ends up having a great career and a lot of success. And it just, the depth of talent in Chicago in your era was pretty sick. No question.
Even downstate, they had Danny Cross and those guys, Howard Nathan. I mean, there was 10 guys in the top 100. So 10% of the top 100 were from Chicago or Illinois. It was unbelievable class.
Yeah. And, you're a blue chip prospect heading into your senior year at Gordon Tech. I know you had an awesome junior year where you guys unfortunately lost the state championship game to King High, which at that point was the powerhouse in Chicago and in Illinois. So you're recruited by Michigan, Michigan State, Kansas, Kentucky, Arizona, DePaul. You mentioned an early affinity for DePaul. But tell me, what's your favorite recruiting story of that kind of journey when you were 16, 17 years old and going through that? At least the ones you can tell on air,
The ones I can tell, let's see. Howard Nathan and I wanted to go to the same school. He's one of my best friends in the world. And we took a trip to Arizona together. And that one was when Arizona was getting good at football. So they were trying to get over a hump. And that night they beat UCLA, which is a huge rivalry. So we come out of an establishment. Somebody says something to Howard, and Howard makes a comment to the whole football team, and they all get out of the car. I mean, linemen. I mean, we were high school kids. We were 17 years old. And they just took off after him. And so here I am. I'm going to help my teammate. And, he gets away from him, and the football players can't find him. And all of a sudden I hear him, TK, I'm up here. And Howard's sitting on the roof of an apartment building. So it was crazy. So that's pretty memorable, and I can tell. I had great times at Michigan State with Peplowski and Steve Smith, Kentucky with Jamal Mashburn and Sean Woods. Had some really great recruiting trips. Yeah, pretty cool.
Who was the most kind of memorable coach you interacted with? Because, I mean, you're talking about some marquee coaches of those programs. Who really kind of just impressed the hell out of you?
Coach Izzo was, my sister was at Michigan State at the time. She's 2 years older than me, Tracy. She went to Resurrection, neighborhood girl. So she was at Michigan State at the time. So it was DePaul or Michigan State for a long time. And I talked to him every day, probably for 3 years. And, he was Coach Heath, Coach top assistant. And I had such a great relationship with him. He's a class act, still is to this day. Talking to him every day. That's the hardest thing I had to do was tell Coach Izzo that I was going to go to DePaul. That was tough. He's a class act.
DePaul and Michigan State were your top two?
Yeah, and then probably Kentucky and Michigan. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Kentucky.
We're going to get to Michigan in a moment. So you selected DePaul. You're a member of which is a member of the 1909 family, one of our schools. What led you to DePaul? Besides that early affinity for DePaul, being a local school, what really attracted to them? Because, people, I think, forget what DePaul was at that point too, especially Chicago guys. We know where DePaul was in like the late 80s and stuff like that. But what really drew you to DePaul?
Well, I think you hit it on the head. I think people really forget how it was. We were the original superstation, so we were on GN all the time. So if we walked into Spokane, Washington to play Gonzaga, they knew our whole roster. If we went down to Atlanta to play, everybody knew DePaul. It wasn't, like now where you got 10 games on a Tuesday night. Like you were pretty much watching WGN. And that's one of the reasons. We had 31 games on. Every game was nationally televised. We were one of the top teams in the country. We had one of the top recruiting classes coming in. I know Michigan was number one with the Fab Five, but we were like number 3. We had 2 McDonald's All-Americans with Howard and myself, and we had a top 30, a top 50. So we were loaded. The future was bright. We were top 10 in the country that year, my freshman year. But, I have a big family, big Irish family, Irish-German family. So, I wanted to stay in the neighborhood. I got to obviously love of my neighborhood and my family. And then obviously growing up on DePaul with, Tyrone Corbin and Strickland and those guys. I mean, I just loved DePaul. So it was a tough choice, but at the end, I just want to stay home and hoop for his city team.
Yeah. When you probably I would think one of your formative experiences, maybe watching that 79 team, you were probably 7 years old or so. I don't know how much you remember that 79 team, but did that kind of seep in a little bit too? And that kind of that DePaul love? Yeah,
I really caught the tail end. That's when I really started watching it. But I remember those Tyrone Corbin teams. Those were I knew Aguirre and those guys. I knew they were good. I was still a little bit too young. But I remember, watching Comegys and Tyrone Corbin, Stanley Brundy, Strickland, T. Green, Kevin Edwards. That's when I was like, that was the heyday. For me, that was 82 to 87, 89. And, I was making a choice in 90, 91. So those guys really got me hooked on ball.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so, you after you kind of select DePaul, I think early on in your senior year, I think maybe right around the start of the basketball season, I think you commit to DePaul. You have this awesome senior season at Gordon Tech. Unfortunately, it ends with a foot injury, but you're all state in Illinois. You play in the 91 McDonald's All-American game. When you're kind of on that stage, marquee game along the best talent in your class, what kind of stands out about that experience that you had there and being along those guys, being on the court with them, some practices? What really stands out about that experience at the 91 McDonald's All-American game?
Just probably the goal attainment, because it wasn't the NBA in 6th or 7th or 8th grade or freshman year or anything like that. It was making the McDonald's game. I remember going to see Johnny Dawkins at the Horizon, and my dad graduated with Coach Krzyzewski at Weber. So Coach, I was a little guy. We're sitting at the rise, and then Coach Krzyzewski came up and said, "Watch this Dawkins kid. He's going to be pretty good." So from that on, my goal was I want to make the McDonald's All-American game. It wasn't the NBA or anything like that. I just want to play in that game. So maybe the goal attainment and then taking a picture with, not only all the players, but Morgan Wooten and your name and your jerseys in the Basketball Hall of Fame for a year. A lot of people don't know that. If you make the McDonald's game, they got your jersey. It's actually in the Hall of Fame. So we played in Springfield, Mass. So we're like, all these young kids, naive and stuff. But it's really cool just the goal attainment to really reaching a goal you had for 6 or 7 years. And then obviously all the talent on the floor. It's on TV. The whole country's watching. So kind of blows your mind. And I still, it's one of the biggest goals I've ever attained in my life.
Yeah.
Truly, truly appreciate and respect playing in that game.
If I can ask you candidly too, like how much did you really kind of realize that and take that in as a 17 or 18-year-old? I mean, I could sense the appreciation now, but when you're at that age and you're in the Basketball Hall of Fame, you're around all this talent. Do you appreciate it more now, or did you get a sense of it then? Do you think?
I think I did. To be honest, usually don't. Youth is usually wasted on the young, but at the time, I really did appreciate it because I knew, just waiting for that call. You see all the nominations, you see the list of great players who are nominated for it. So you kind of have pressure on yourself. You got to have a good junior year. You got to have a good senior year. You have to play well at Nike. So there's a lot of levels that go into that selection. And the talented players that are up for that spot, I mean, you could have, 20 guys at your position that all of them, really could be in that game. And so just the levels that you had to go through for 2 years to get picked, I did have an appreciation at a young age for it, to be quite honest.
Yeah, that's awesome. Was there something that you experienced during that week, when you're around all this great basketball talent? Was there something you experienced that week where that just kind of sticks with you? Like, I've never seen someone do that on a basketball court before. Or
yeah, I think, Howard Nathan playing in that game, again, he was a Peoria kid, kind of Central Illinois kid. He really put, we all knew it in Illinois, but I don't know if the country knew it. But I know the other point guards in the country knew it because they always used, like Travis Best said, man, Howard Nathan's, he's a bad boy. He's cold. I haven't seen anything like that. And then he went nuts in that game for like a 5 or 6 minute streak that he put himself on the map as far as the country. I mean, he had 7 points, 8 assists, 6 steals, something crazy. And he was just going to work. And I think he really put himself on the map. And then I think Chris Webber had he broke records in scoring and rebounding in that game. I think he had 30 and 15. He broke Jordan's record or something. It was just, there was a lot of men on the court at that time, but he really was head and shoulders above everybody else. He was a man.
And, sticking with Weber, you're on the West squad with Weber, but that West squad also includes Jalen Rose, your buddy from Chicago, Juwan Howard, has Jimmy King on it. A year later, those guys are the talk of college basketball, and they're, from a cultural perspective, but also they're playing in the Final Four too. So When you got to see those guys together and you knew that those 4 guys were going to Michigan together, would you have predicted that? Because we remember in 1991, freshmen didn't take over college basketball at that time. Guys stayed along, And so would you have ever been around those 4 guys, seeing them together on the court? Could you have predicted that, or what did you think kind of set those guys apart?
I could have predicted greatness, but not that soon. No one could have predicted that. I mean, they had size, they had all the pieces. Maybe their sophomore year, like you said, guys were sticking around a junior and senior year back then. They weren't playing 6 months of college ball and leaving. So, but to compete at that level, first of all, they had to beat out some pretty talented players on the Michigan team that were above them already in juniors with Eric Riley and Tolbert and those guys. They had to beat some pretty top quality guys on their own team. And then they did that, and then they took off. And just their competitiveness, their belief in each other, their togetherness, and really the biggest thing, I mean, you got to be competitive, tough, and talented, but their selflessness at that age is very difficult. For any young player, even college and pro, ego steps in and everybody wants to be the man. But to be able to have that total selflessness as five guys was incredible. And it's a reason why they attained so much success.
Yeah. And, you were recruited by Michigan. You mentioned earlier they were one of your kind of top choices. Obviously, Juwan Howard, your buddy from Chicago, goes there. Do you ever look back, honestly, and say, like, damn, I could have been one of the Fab Five?
Yeah, as I grow older, yeah, I do. I remember Juwan committed. They were in Chicago. They went to Juwan's house first, and I was on a home visit with Roy Williams from Kansas. My phone rings, and somebody answers the phone, and I get on the phone, which is totally disrespectful. I took the phone call, and they said, Juwan just committed. We'd like you to commit right now. And I said, well, I'm not ready to commit yet. It's still September or whatever it was. And they go, well, we're recruiting Jimmy King and you at the spot. Whoever commits first. I go, all right, well, I'm going to take my time with a little bit. And then Jimmy committed, and then I was out. But looking back now, yeah, I look at it and say, what if? But if looking back, it's crazy to think you could have been part of that. But I'm very happy where I went in my career, and I might have not have had the little success I had as a player if I didn't go to DePaul. So I'm very, very, very happy I stayed home.
Yeah, it's just always, and I don't mean to question kind of the success, and fun times you had at DePaul. Just sometimes you're like, damn, I could have been a part of a cultural revolution. But would the Fab Five have held as much weight with Tom Kleinschmidt in there, not Jimmy King? Who knows,
Great guys, all of them, man. They're all great guys.
So I wanted to, we talked earlier about Finley, Michael Finley from Proviso East High School, just outside Chicago. And again, mentioned he was honestly probably the third best guy in that high school team with Donnie Boyce and Sherrell Ford. They were freaks. And so when you think about the class in 1991, again, going back 30 years, all the guys you played against, maybe who surprised you the most? Now, maybe this is a guy who ended up really developing his game and becoming kind of a star. And you're like, man, I don't know if I would have seen that. Or maybe a guy who, man, I would have bet my house that guy would have been a stud. And for whatever reason, things just didn't work out for him. So who kind of maybe, as you look back at that, maybe who are some of the guys who surprised a little bit?
It's a tough call because all of them had some success either in the NBA or overseas. I mean, obviously Mike's the answer. He wasn't a surprise. You knew he was good, but his development and the strides he took in a short period of time. And again, it comes down to college choices and making the right choice. I mean, his staff at Wisconsin was Sean Miller, Stu Jackson, Van Gundy. I mean, those were the guys on the Wisconsin staff when he was a freshman and a sophomore. So, I mean, you see what those coaches are doing now in their past. But can you imagine getting your hands on a 6'6" freak athlete like Mike at 18 years old? And so he really made the great choice. And then he played in the Big Ten, which is ultra competitive. So there's a lot of – and Mike's hard work and the person he is really propelled him. But that perfect storm coming together, I can't speak for Mike, but I would guess he may tend to agree with me if you put all those things together. Shelley Clark's another one. He was kind of just a raw, big, strong guy. He played at Illinois, about 6'10", and as a sophomore, he wasn't very good. Junior, he got big. He was always big, strong, and mean, but he really took off and developed as he went and played for Illinois. And then obviously I keep talking about Howard. I knew he was always good, but I hear stories of him and Mookie Blaylock going at it at Atlanta Hawks camp, and Kenny Norman saying, this kid from Illinois is unbelievable. He's going at it with Mookie Blaylock, an NBA All-Star, and he's 21 years old. So Donnie Boyce doesn't get the love I think he deserves. He was probably known as the best player on that team, and for good reason at that time. He was a 6'5", 6'6" point guard, a true point guard. And if he wouldn't have shattered his leg in that Big 8 championship, he still ended up making the league for a little bit. But Donnie was very underrated because, you didn't see big point guards like that at that time. You saw kind of smaller guards, and Donnie was a 6'6" true point guard, so he's amazing. So those guys I would say off the top of my head.
What did you notice, because, I think there's this in my own mind, there's this misperception sometimes. Well, hey, if guys don't make it to the league, they're some people would say they're bust outs. It's like, man, do you understand how difficult that is?
Right.
And so like, just from you, let's talk about just that transition from high school to college. Like, what was the biggest thing you had to adjust to going from Gordon Tech to DePaul. And I know you had some experiences in the pro game too, some NBA tryouts and things like that.
Sure.
What was kind of, how different was that then? So can you talk about the jump from high school to college, and then college to, kind of trying to make the league a little bit too?
Sure. So high school to college, and it's the same at both levels, but it gets, the window gets really small when you're at those top. And just quickly, yeah, it drives me crazy when somebody says that guy's a scrub at the end of the bench. Well, I like to say, there's 500 people in the world with that guy's job. But what do you do for a profession? And is there
Absolutely,
500?
Man.
Yeah. So, but going back, so the speed of the game and the strength of the game, and the way guys shoot the ball in college to pro. I mean, it was definitely the speed of the game. I mean, guys were on roller skates when you first got on. Like you're playing Cincinnati or Louisville. I mean, just the speed, size, and quickness of guys. You had to catch up with that, and that takes guys. It takes them a year, sometimes a year and a half, to catch up with that. Freshman year was very, frustrating for me. I was not mature. I wanted to transfer every time I didn't play. Yeah, everything a kid that would do now that would drive me crazy. So my hat's off to Coach Joe Meyer sticking with me for so long. But then it kind of clicked a little bit my sophomore year. But yeah, speed of the game, size of the game, strength, and then high school, you got two guys on the floor maybe that can shoot it. You're playing college ball, you got 4 or 5 guys that can shoot it. So got to guard everybody. And then pro game was about angles, and I didn't know that. I didn't make a team. I was the last cut with Sherelle and those guys in Seattle. I learned a ton of the camps I went to, and I really learned a lot from Coach Majerus, who was running the Seattle camp at the time for Coach Carl when I was in Seattle. I was in a Coach Riley camp. I mean, I was around, Majerus, Carl, Coach Riley. I was around some guys that really taught me the game. Coach Musselman, who's now at Arkansas, I played for him a little bit in the CBA. So I really learned a lot in 2 years, and it really propelled me to play overseas for 12 years. So just coaches talk about angles in the program. I had no idea what they were talking about. Guys going side to side instead of straight line at the bucket. So stuff and terminology you had to catch up with, and there's not a lot of time. You either get it or you don't. And then when you get it, you can come back and give it a shot. But if you don't get it right away, they're not wasting 2-3 months on you. If you don't get it right away, we'll get somebody else. So, and those guys, there's not a lot of changeover. There's 500 guys at the time that played in the league, and 400 of those jobs are taken. So you got everybody in the world fighting for 100 jobs. It's tough, man. So very fortunate and blessed to play overseas for as long as I did.
And, you had a really nice overseas career too, and that became kind of a nice life for you. What was what was your favorite or most unique experience about playing? Because you spent a good time of your season. I think you had your best years in Japan. And
yes.
What was kind of the most unique or different about that?
Yeah, just learning a different culture. I've never been off the north side or the west side of Chicago. I mean, if you think about high school, college, my first year professionally was in the CBA at the UIC. I mean, I never left Chicago, ever. Never went on spring break, never went anywhere. So, I find myself in the middle in a Tokyo airport with 2 suitcases, and they're speaking Japanese or PA, and I was totally like, I'm going home, and it takes a certain person to be able to handle it. I mean, a lot of times you're alone, sitting in a room, before, you hang out with your teammates and such, but the biggest mistake some really talented guys in college make is I'll just go overseas. Well, it's not as easy as you would think. I mean, there's guys that you can go over and make $2,000 a month, but if you want to go over and make them 40 or 60 a month, $1,000 a month, it's a little different story. You got to be able to handle it. You got to be mature. They're not wasting time on you as well. So there's a lot that goes into it, and there's culture shock. I had it. I said I wouldn't last 6 months, and I'm very blessed to have some good teammates, Japanese-wise, Italian-wise, Venezuelan-wise, that really took care of me. And I also had some older Americans that have been around that I was just lucky enough to be on the same team with. Larry Lewis, Fred Lewis, Steve Bardo. Those guys really took me under their wing and said, if you want to do this, this is kind of the roadmap. Kenny Walker from Kentucky. So those guys, I had some old veterans that calmed me down and said, give it a shot. And I was blessed to have those guys in my life at that time.
That's awesome. Talking about just kind of the differences between two different kind of environments. You're now a coach you're back at your alma mater, Gordon Tech, but has been rebranded as a DePaul Prep there in Chicago. There's a generation between you in your high school playing days and the kids you're coaching today. I'm curious about what are the biggest differences you see in today's high school game and the athletes and the experience that those kids have today compared to what you experienced. Because, I mean, you think about just zone defenses, which 30 years ago, not many dudes playing zone. It was almost looked at as like a sign of weakness. And then you had, AAU is obviously a much different environment. Sure. YouTube. I mean, so what are some of the biggest differences you see between kids today and kind of what you had? Because you've had some good ballers at DePaul of late.
I have. I'm very fortunate to have some great young men come through the program. And probably what they relate to, I'm going to sound like an old man, but the physicality of the game is different. It's not as physical as it was when I played either in high school, outdoors. Kids don't even play outdoors. Go drive by a park and tell me how many kids you see playing on concrete. It's like going to ruin their career that hasn't started yet. It drives me crazy. Like, you used to go to Shabona Park there and there'd be 20 guys waiting on a game, or you go outside, drive. There's nobody in the park. So a little bit of the physicality and toughness is gone. But what really has blown us away out of the water is the size and athleticism and the shooting capability of the bigs. I mean, this is so far above and beyond what we were at that time. I mean, there were no 6'11" shooting threes. There wasn't, 6'9" point guards. There was one maybe, and that was it. Now they're everywhere. So the athleticism and the way the bigs shoot the ball now is kind of blown us out of the water as far as my era. But I don't think the toughness is there. I know that may sound like an old man, but if Jordan played with these rules, he would have shot 45 free throws a game, and the game would have been 6 hours long. They just get to the line. 32 attempts at the line is crazy. So
yeah,
that's what I think. Yeah,
is it difficult for you to coach because you were a dude who had such success, and is it difficult to kind of like, hey, why can't you just hit 7 threes a game? I did. Is it hard for you to how do you navigate that? Because let's face it, man, as a high school baller, you were so freaking good. Yeah, is it hard? And some things probably came very naturally to you. Is it hard? How do you kind of navigate kind of communicating that to kids you're coaching today?
Well, it's wild. You kind of bounce back on the lessons that you were taught growing up that you might not have understood at the time, but it's not real hard. You want to be a good shooter, you got to shoot. You talk, everyone wants to play video games. First time you played a video game, you got killed. So you kind of got to get in their mind a little bit. You play for 3 hours, you're flipping the game. You want to be a good shooter, you got to put the work in. So, you kind of talk to them. First of all, you don't try to fake it with a relationship. You got to gain their trust first. They're not going to listen to you. They know first if you're lying to them. So you got to get their trust and be real with them. And even if they don't like what you're saying, they know deep down if it's the right thing or not. So they get it. And then they buy in, and then you kind of got them. To answer your question with you just preach hard work and dedication and skilling and crafting your game. And then they either get it or they don't. You know what I mean? But when you can get a group of guys and you have some good leaders like I've been fortunate to have, it makes it easier because all you got to do is worry about practice in the games. You don't have to worry about the locker room, guys being on time for practice, not screwing around in class, turning into work. The kids kind of handle all that if you got good leadership, so it makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, well, we've come full circle, man. Started talking about you being a little guy on the north side, and now you're coaching back on the north side. So let's end it there, Tom, and let you get on with your day there at DePaul Prep. Appreciate you joining us here on the 19-9 podcast. Thanks, of course, to Tom Kleinschmidt for sharing his time discussing the class of 1991, and thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Visit 199.com for some of the flyest college basketball gear around, and subscribe to our podcast for more shows celebrating basketball history and culture. Until next time, this is the Chucker signing off.
Thank you for listening to the 19-9 podcast. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, make sure you do. And while you're at it, leave us a rating or review. 5 stars only, like the basketball camp. We also have links to all of 19-9 social media so you never miss a release. Until next time.